Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the grand finals of the Champions Chess Tour Chessable Masters in the year 2024. Now, Magnus Carlsen was the winner of the top division, and coming up to face him from the lower division was the wonderkin from Iran, Alireza Firouzja, now representing France. Now, the format is very difficult because they play a best-of-4 match. If Alireza Firouzja is able to win that match, there will be another match with 2 games. If Magnus Carlsen wins the match, the best-of-4, it is simply all over but the crying. Now, in general, it's very hard to come from behind when you have to win 2 matches against top players, but yours truly, Hikaru Nakamura, I did it against Fabiano Caruana last year in the Chessable Masters, and in the final event of the regular season in 2023, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave also defeated Magnus Carlsen. So while it's difficult and the statistics say it's unlikely, it has happened before. Without further ado, let's jump right into the action. So the first game we're going to be taking a look at is in the best-of-4 match. Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces, Alireza Firouzja with the black pieces, game 1. So we get the move g3 from Magnus. Alireza goes d5. We get the move knight to f3. Now we have the move g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, and Magnus plays d4. Now, I remember many years ago, around 2016 or 2017, Magnus Carlsen and I had some epic matches in what was the Speed Chess Championship back then, or maybe it was called the Death Matches. I forget what it was, but we actually had this position after castles e5, d3 many times. But Magnus in this match today doesn't want to allow the setup where black gets the big black center. So Magnus decides to play d4, which stops e5. Now we get knight to f6. We get c4, c6, castles, and we are in what we call the classic Grunfeld opening or Grunfeld defense. But black has also played d5 and c6, which has shades of the semi-Slav as well. So it's a sort of a hybrid between playing a Grunfeld setup with the fianchetto with the bishop on g7, pawn on d5, but then you also play a Slav system with the pawns on d5 and c6 to boot. So here Magnus goes knight c3, Alireza takes the pawn, and now we get the move e4 being played. Now what Magnus is doing here is he's gambiting a pawn on the c4 square, but he's trying to build his big white center here with these great pawns on d4 and e4. Alireza goes b5. We now get the move queen to e2, and Alireza plays a5 here, starting to push some p on the queen side, taking some space here, and arguing that these extra pawns are worth more than the big white center. Magnus now plays the move rook to d1. We get the move knight bd7. The move d5 is played here by Magnus, a logical move here trying to break apart black's pawn chain. Now here these pawns are all very supportive of each other. The pawn on c6 supports the pawn on b5, which supports the pawn on c4. But when Magnus goes d5, he first of all has the rook on the open file, but he's trying to break up this whole chain of support. So after d5, Alireza decides to take the pawn, and now Magnus plays e5, ignoring the pawn because he wants to harass this knight on f6 and force it to move from the f6 square. Alireza, however, does not care whatsoever, and he decides to play this move b4, sacking a knight on f6 here with pawn takes knight, knight takes pawn, and now Alireza has these massive pawns here in the center of the board. It's a very unusual scene with all these pawns so far advanced thus far, but Alireza figures, I've got all these pawns, the knight is not as good as these 3 pawns, and for that reason, I should be better. So Magnus plays knight to b5. We get bishop d7, a4 played here. Magnus trying to hook this knight in on this b5 square. Alireza now trades and goes e6. So now Alireza has a classic connect 5 here with the king down to the pawn on c4. If black can just keep pushing p on the queen side, black is going to win this game very quickly. However, both players at this point were still moving pretty fast, which tells me that Magnus specifically was still in preparation, because if you have not seen this before, you'd be using a lot of time here with the white pieces trying to figure out what on earth is going on. So we get knight to d4. Alireza plays a4, pushing p, expanding. Maybe one day Alireza wants to emulate his favorite streamer Eric Rosen here and try to get the classic connect 7. Connect 7 is very rarely seen in the game of chess, but a connect 7 here would simply be overwhelming. So after a4, Magnus goes knight to c6. We get the move queen to b6 being played. Now both of these pawns are hanging. Magnus does gobble the pawn on b4 here. We get queen takes pawn on b5, and now the move bishop to d2 is played. So here Alireza has lost his chain of pawns to some degree because he no longer possesses the b pawn, but in return he has this very nice chain of pawns from f7 to c4. Pawn on a4 still very well placed, and also the pawn on b2 can become a very easy target for black to attack in the next couple of moves. So after bishop d2, Alireza plays knight to d7 here, trying to open up the scope for the darks for a bishop on g7. Magnus goes bishop c3, we get knight to c5 being played, and now Magnus decides to play h4. Now one of the things that Magnus understands here is that it's very hard for black to push the pawns in the center of the board. White has this nice blockade with the bishop and the pawn, so it's very hard to push the c pawn. If you ever go d4, you hang a pawn. If you ever go e5, you hang a pawn on d5. So because black's pawns can't go forward in this position, Magnus takes the opportunity to start expanding on the king side, creating some classic luft for the king on h2, but also maybe trying to play h5 and h6 and create the classic lolly checkmate down the road. So after h4, Alireza plays knight to b3, we get bishop takes bishop, king takes bishop, and Magnus plays queen to e5, checking the king on g7. Here Alireza plays f6. If Alireza were to move the king back to g8, now white is actually close to winning after this move h5, because now if you take the rook on a1, I go h6 with the idea of creating the classic Jean-Baptiste lolly checkmate with queen to g7, and if black goes f6 stopping the mate, now white can take the pawn, you scoot the king away, and there's queen e7, and the lolly mate is still unstoppable here. If you were to play rook g8 to stop the mate, you hang the pawn, and again queen g7 is checkmate. If you go like rook a7, I take the rook. So there's really no way to stop the two mate threats on these two squares right around the black king. So after queen to e5, Alireza plays f6, we get queen takes pawn, now we get queen takes knight here. Computer does like knight takes a1 as well, but Alireza was probably concerned that after knight takes d5, rook a e8, and queen d6 here, white is threatening to capture the knight on a1. White is also threatening to fork the queen and the rook with knight to c7, one example like this, and for that reason he decides to play in this position to play the move queen takes b4. Magnus takes the pawn on d5, sacking the rook on a1, and Alireza plays rook a7. If Alireza were to capture what looks like a free rook in the corner, white is actually winning after rook to d7 check, creating the kebab on the 7th, king to h8, and now bishop takes rook on a8. And the reason white is winning is quite simple. If black takes the bishop, there's queen f7 threatening mate on h7. If you ignore it and try to bring your knight back with knight b3, now white goes bishop to d5, and after you play a move like, let's just say a3 for example, white can go rook to f7 here, threatening to mate you on this f6 square. If you trade the rooks, there's queen g8 and queen f6, both mates exist here, and for that reason your king is just too weak and there's no way to stop mate without hemorrhaging a lot of material. So after rook takes d5, Alireza plays rook to a7 to combat this check on d7. Magnus goes rook a d1, we get rook e7, rook to d7. White does not hang the queen because then the king on g7 would be captured. Game continues with rook f7, we get rook takes rook, rook takes rook. Magnus plays rook d7, we get the swap, and now king h6 is played. Now on first glance the dust is settled to some degree and black has one extra pawn. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4. So white has one less pawn, but the black king is a little bit weak on h6. Now what's amazing is that in this position the computer does not care that black is an extra pawn because the king's safety is more important. So white is actually a little bit better according to the comp. So we get bishop to d5 here from Magnus, which is not the best move. It actually wants to move queen to e6 to sort of keep an eye on all of these pawns at the same time. Magnus goes bishop d5 instead, very logical move because he wants to try and sneak in and checkmate from behind with bishop g8 and queen takes h7, mating the black king. However, Alireza now has the move queen to e1 check, we get the move king to g2, and now this very tricky move knight to d2, which not only guards the pawn on c4 but threatens to win material here with queen f1 check on the next turn. So for example, white goes bishop g8, it's spaghetti-o time with queen f1 check, king h2, and now knight to f3, and the white king is simply stuck. It's game over, resigns, you know, best of luck next time. So after knight to d2, Magnus finds the only move, which is queen to a7, supporting the pawn on f2. So after black plays queen to f1 for example, king h2, no mate on f3, and the pawn on f2 is guarded. And if you get careless and play f5 after queen to e3, checking the king moves, you lose the horse, GG, why not? So here queen e5 is played by Alireza, and now Magnus goes queen c5, we get king to g7, stopping white from going for the mate with queen to f8, and now we get queen a5. After queen to a5, we get a3, we get this move b takes a3 from Magnus, and this was a move that surprised me because at this point the time was relatively even and Magnus could have played queen takes knight, pawn push, queen to d1, stopping black from getting a second queen. And after black, for example, say not queen d1, sorry, not queen d1, queen a5, my mistake, queen d1 would actually lose the game to queen takes b2 because you queen the pawn. But after queen to a5 here, you cover the e1 square, you cover the a1 square. If black was queen b2, you go check, king h6, and bishop to g8, which is checkmate. And for that reason, black has to promote to a queen. You get takes, king g1. Both sides have a queen and 4 pawns, and this would be drawn instantly. Instead, Magnus decides to capture the pawn, and this is where it becomes clear that Magnus is feeling like he's playing with house money. He can take some risks, and he doesn't think he can ever lose the game. So Alireza goes c3 here, pushing p, trying to use his passed pawn. We get queen to a7, king to h6, and now Magnus goes queen c5. Now you might be wondering, why not bishop g8? If you go bishop g8, now there's queen e4 checking the king, and after say king h2, there's knight to f3. If you go king to h1, I take and mate you on g2. And in this position, if you go king to g2, for example, now there's knight takes h4. If you go back, same mate. If you go to f1, I believe it's, is it, which one? I think it's queen b1 check. Yeah, queen b1, king e2, and queen c2, king e3. And I think now after knight f5 or knight g2, black is winning here with a sequence of moves. So Magnus plays queen to c5 here. And now we get c2 from Alireza. Magnus plays queen to f8, and already here is very, very tricky. This pawn is threatening to queen. You can't capture because you lose the bishop, and you're not really in time to checkmate very easily. Now the computer here wants a sort of strange looking move g4 here, because after takes queen, now white can go g5. If you take, I make the checks here. It's a simple repetition, and the king can never escape the checks. And if you were to go king to g7 here, it's the same thing. I just check. You go king to f8, and I just check forever ad infinitum, and the game will end in a draw here too. Instead, Magnus, starting to get low on time, plays move queen to f8. We get king to h5. Now we get queen to f7, and this is an epic fail. Still in this position after g4, the game would be a draw, but this is a move that if you don't see the reason, which is king takes g4 and queen b4 specifically, you will never play this move, and with seconds on the clock, it's just not human. Magnus goes queen f7 instead, and now Alireza plays h6, avoiding the checkmate threats. If you were to say queen, for example, there's a very cute checkmate here with takes, king g4, and now queen takes g6, queen g5, f3, takes, and the king is simply trapped on the g4 square. So after h6, now Magnus is completely lost because black is threatening to queen, and you can't even stop this pawn very easily. Here, Magnus plays the move queen to d7, and after queen to d7, he simply resigns before Alireza can promote this pawn to a queen, because he realizes that after queen, if you go g4, king h4, there's no checkmate, and now black has an extra queen and will checkmate on the next move or two. So a shocking result in the first game of the best of 4 match. Magnus Carlsen loses with the white piece to Alireza. Alireza goes ahead 1-0. So the next game we're going to be taking a look at is the second game of the match. Now here, Alireza playing with the white pieces, 1-0 lead, feeling pretty good, but will he be able to keep his foot on the gas and try to potentially end this first match before it even begins? So Alireza starts with e4. Now we get the move c6, d4, d5 from Magnus, e5, and bishop f5. Now it's interesting because back when Magnus played the last event in 2023 against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, when he was in a must-win situation, he also chose to play the Caro-Kann defense versus MVL like he does against Alireza today. Alireza plays knight to f3. Now we get e6. We have bishop to e2, a5 played, a4, knight d7, castles, and Magnus goes f6. Now, those of you guys who have watched some streamers like the famous Grandmaster streamer Benjamin Feingold, you've probably heard him say, kids, never push the f-pawn. Do not push your f-pawn. But Magnus Carlsen, he's a former world champion, former 5-time world champion at that. He can do whatever he pleases. He doesn't have to listen to us commentators. And in chess, it's a game where you learn 1,000 rules and you learn when you can break them. And Magnus Carlsen is just that good that usually he can break the rules and get away with them. So after f6, we get bishop to f4 being played, and now we get knight to e7. We get e takes f6, knight takes f6, and now Magnus plays, or Alireza plays bishop d3. What Alireza is trying to do here is take advantage of this weak pawn on e6, and what I really don't like about this position from Magnus's perspective is that white has all the easy moves to try and put pressure on black's position, and black simply doesn't have easy plans. So we get knight to g6. Now bishop g3 played by Alireza. We get bishop to d6 from Magnus. We get rook to e1, castles, and knight bd2. Now Magnus could trade the bishops on d3 here and give Alireza the doubled pawns here, but the pawns are actually very valuable because the pawn on d3 stops the knight from jumping, and the pawn on d4 stops black from pushing e5 and getting rid of the serious weakness on e6. So Magnus instead trades the bishops on g3. We now get the move knight to g4, and Alireza goes knight b3. Now knight b3 is not a move that I was super happy about during the game because it felt to me that in this position black's pieces are sort of trending towards his king side here. He's trying to get an attack going, and when you go knight b3, the knight is going from towards the action over to the side. But Alireza, I suspect, has studied the structure quite carefully, and he also has played the Caro-Kann a lot with black, so he goes for knight b3. Now Magnus quickly plays b6, which is a move that I actually thought made a lot of sense, but it's a blitz move and simply not precise. So b6 guards the pawn on a5. It also stops his knight from ever jumping towards c5 or a5. So knight feels like it's a little bit misplaced, but in reality, b6 here creates some serious weaknesses with the pawns on the 6th rank down the road, as we're going to see. Alireza plays queen to e2. We get queen to f6, trade of the bishops, and now we get queen to e6 check. We get the trade of the queens. We get rook f6, and Alireza goes rook e1. Now it's looking a lot better for white, because now the pawns on c6 and b6 are very, very brittle. They're loose, they're weak, and now white's knight also stops black from playing c5, and it keeps an eye on the pawn on a5. Here Magnus trades the rooks, and now he goes rook to c8. Alireza plays knight c1 here, trying to reroute the knight to d3 and maybe go towards the e5 square. Now we get f4, knight to d3, takes, and now Magnus plays knight f6. Here Alireza goes knight d to e5, and now nearly 6 or 7 moves later, we understand why Alireza went knight b3 to begin with, which is these pawns on c6 and b6 are going to fall. The queen side is going to fall, just like, what's the saying, it's like president down or president falls, whatever the saying is from all those movies that I watched years ago. At any rate, we get knight d e5. Now we have knight takes knight, knight takes knight. We get the move pawn to c5, and here Alireza captures the pawn on b6. We get c takes d4, and now the move knight c6 is played. Now knight c6 is okay here, but the computer actually says in this position, after the move b4, you temporarily sack a pawn and start pushing p on the a file, and the computer thinks that white is close to winning. Black cannot capture this pawn on c2, because after rook b8, it's spaghetti-o time. King can't move to f7, and after knight e8, rook takes e8. It's simply checkmate, GG, why not? Instead, Alireza plays knight c6 here, trying to go after d4 and a5, but now Magnus brings the king to f7. We get rook b7, king to e8, knight takes pawn, and now the move rook to c4, creating the kebab where we're attacking the pawns and the knight at the same time. Alireza plays c3. We get rook takes a4, rook takes g7, rook to a1, king to f2, and now rook to b1. Here rook b7 is played by Alireza. We get knight to e4 check, forking the king and these pawns. We get king to e3, knight takes pawn. White cannot capture the horse, because then you lose the rook and the game. Alireza goes king to f4, and now Magnus misses his chance to draw the game pretty much instantly here. He plays the move knight to a4. Now again, players are low on time. They're obviously not stockfish, so you can't expect perfect play, but nonetheless, this tricky move a4 would have more or less ensured a draw, because if white plays a random waiting move like king g4, for example, now after a3, if you take the knight or the pawn, you lose the rook, and if you push the pawn, now my pawn is getting to the end of the board very, very quickly, and white will have to give up either the knight or the rook in order to keep the game going, but you will lose either way. And after a4, rook to f4, which is the best move, now black can go knight d1, rook takes a4, and after rook takes b2, the pawn on g2 is very weak. It's even material, both sides have 2 pawns on the board, and there's no way Magnus would ever lose here. Instead, Magnus decides to play the move knight to a4, which gives Alireza the chance to play b3, and after rook to e1 played here, now this move king f5. Now if white were to take what looks like a free horse, there's rook e4 check, king f5, rook d4, and this position is simply a dead drawn rook and pawn endgame. Instead, we get king to f5. Now we have knight to c3 from Magnus and the move rook h7. The big difference between this position and the other one is that, first of all, white is up a pawn here. He's captured the h7 pawn, but also black has been unable to eliminate these 2 queenside pawns. And in endgames, if you're up a pawn or 2 pawns, the more pawns you have on the board, the more chances of winning the game. So we get rook g1 from Magnus. Now king e6 is played, threatening mate in Uno with rook to h8. We get king to f8. Knight to f5 here, again threatening checkmate in Uno with rook to h8, because the king cannot move up on the board here. So after knight to f5, we get rook to e1, king to f6, knight to e4, king to g6, and now Magnus runs his king the other way. If he were to play a move like rook b1, now it's checkmate on h8, because the king can't get out to e7 since the knight holds the square from the other side. So after king g6, we get king to e8. Now we have rook to e7, king to d8, rook to e5 played here, pressuring the pawn on d5, and now Magnus plays rook d1. We get to move g4, and already here the computer thinks this is close to loss, because now Alireza has a simple plan of pushing p up the board, and you can't really stop the p from getting to the end. Magnus plays king d7. Now we get to move knight to e3 here, forking the pawn on d5 and the rook on d1. Now we have rook to b1. we get knight takes d5, and Magnus plays this move knight to c5, frittering away the game instantly when Alireza spots the fossil with this move knight to c3, which attacks both the rook and the knight at the same time. In this position, your knight and rook look safe, but after knight c3, both of these pieces, the rook and the knight, are under attack. You cannot save them both. If you go knight d3, there's rook d5 check, king c6, and rook takes knight. If you play rook takes pawn, I take the knight and I guard, or I take the pawn and I guard my knight at the same time. And now again, I'm simply going to push the g pawn up the board and win the game. So Magnus Carlsen loses 2 games in a row to Alireza Firouzja, loses with white in game 1, loses in game 2 with black, and with that, Alireza takes a commanding 2-0 lead. Now Magnus Carlsen would strike back and win the 3rd game with the white pieces in a London system. Game 4 would end in a draw, which means that Alireza Firouzja wins the best of 4 match by a score of 2.5 to 1.5, and they move into the reset best of 2 match, same time control, 10 minutes plus 2-second increment. So in the first game of the best of 2, Magnus Carlsen is the white pieces, and he decides to open with the move d4. Now we get knight to f6, and Magnus Carlsen plays bishop g5, essaying the classic trump house key opening here, which I actually played quite a bit during the Chess Champions Tour final last year in Toronto. We get the move d5, we get e3, and now the move c5, and here Magnus plays the move knight to d2. Now in the Chess Champions Tour final in Toronto, I played many games with pawn takes pawn on c5 here, and after e6 or e5, I think I drew most of the games, but I had some chances. Nonetheless, Magnus goes knight d2. After knight to d2, we now get the move knight c6, we get c3, c takes d4, e takes d4, and Alireza goes h6. Now we have bishop to h4, bishop to f5, we get knight to f3 being played here, and after knight to f3 in this position, we now have the move which is played, which is bishop to knight f3 e6, and now we get bishop to e2. So after bishop to e2 in this position, we have the move bishop d6 being played here, and after bishop to d6, Magnus decides to castle. After castles, we get queen to c7, and Magnus goes bishop g3. Now what Alireza is doing here is he has a choice. Do I want to be a hero, or do I want to be solid? Now there's a song that's popping in my head right now, which is, I need a hero. And in this situation, it's very difficult to decide. Now Alireza is a very young kid. He's very confident in his abilities for obvious reasons, but he has to decide, do I want to be solid with castles against a player like Magnus Carlsen, who is very, very positional and very strong, or do I want to try and be a hero and castle the other way to the queen side and attack him and try to mate him and brutally win this match? So Alireza decides to go for it here. He trades the bishops, plays h5, we get rook e1 g6, knight f1, knight g4, queen d2, and now he castles to the queen side. Now one of the things is this looks very scary because this h file can open since white has double pawns. For example, let me just illustrate it. Say white goes something like knight h2. Knight h2 is a bad move. What's an example? Let me just put this knight on d3, for example. If black can rip open this h file here, let's just say rook d1 or rook h8, black is going to stack the rooks and checkmate the white king very, very quickly, and it won't even be close. So the danger is that black gets h4 and opens up the h file. On the other hand, white can try and push p on the queen side very quickly and attack black's knight, queen, and king here and go for the kill. So Magnus plays b4. Now one good thing for Magnus, h4 is not a move because it is guarded by both this knight and the pawn which cover the square. Alireza plays king b8, we get a4, and now he goes f6, intending to either play e5 and build the big black center or go g5 and h4. So after f6, we get knight to h4 from Magnus. A very, very good move. Very good understanding here from Magnus that even though Alireza goes g5 and we get this trade, this idea of h4 is simply going to be too slow here. So Magnus plays bishop d3, attacking this pawn on f5. Alireza goes knight to e7, retreating this knight away, which first of all is very important because white is threatening to harass the knight. For example, say you get b5, you have to waste time moving the knight away. So Alireza goes here, dual fold, no attack with b5 on the knight on c6, and you guard the pawn on f5, and you intend to go h4 and mate on the h file. But Magnus now plays f3, knight to h6, and he plays this move rook to e6, creating a great kebab on the 6th rank, threatening to hit these pawns on f6 and g5 and the knight on h6. There's also rook e1 with a double stack on the e file here as well, and already here the computer is giving Magnus a big advantage. We get rook hf8, guarding the pawn on f6, rook ae1, we get knight to c8 so you don't hang the horse, and now Magnus goes a5. Now what you'll probably have noticed here is that in this position black's attack has become non-existent. He doesn't have the rook on the h file. There's no h4 g4 big attack here. G4 for example would hang the knight. H4, white can even just take the pawn, and you can't take back, and so all of black's attacking ideas on the king side are gone. You can't push these pawns, and now white's attack is still raging on the queen side, and white controls the open e-file here with the double towers. So after a5, we get the move knight to d6 from Alireza. Magnus now goes to a6. We get the move b6, and knight to e3 is played. Now this pawn on a6 is very, very scary here for black because it stops black from being able to push pawns on the queen side. Also, the king can get mated by the lolly again if white ever gets a queen down to this b7 square, and you have serious weaknesses in the center of the board. So here Alireza goes queen d7, and now Magnus proceeds to play like a perfect computer. He plays knight takes pawn. We get knight to e4, trying to win this rook on e6, because if white takes, you win the rook here and you're completely fine. If white takes with the rook, takes for example, now after say knight g4 and h4 or queen h7, maybe black has some chances to survive and or even win the game. But after knight to e4, Magnus Carlsen plays rook takes pawn on b6, sacking the rook and checking the king. We get pawn takes rook, pawn takes knight, and white now has a knight and 2 pawns in return for the rook, and the computer here says that white is completely winning. We get king to a7 here from Alireza, desperately trying to guard the pawn and also stop white from, say, pushing this pawn in a7 and getting an open a file to checkmate the black king. So he gets king a7. You might be thinking, well, now the king is safe. There's no big attack here. Unfortunately, there is a big attack, and Magnus makes no mistake. He plays this great move b5 here with the idea of going knight to b4 and forking the king and the rook by jamming this knight on the c6 square. Alireza trades the pawns on e4, and now he goes queen b5. Pretty much an only move here, because if you were to play a move like rook e8, again, knight to b4 with the knight going to c6 is simply game over. You have this knight that's way off sides here, and the position is totally hopeless, as you can see from the eval bar. So here Alireza plays queen takes b5, and now Magnus plays this great move c4, the most explosive move in the game of chess after a 2-minute think. Now there are a couple things that are important. First of all, when you look at the time here, Magnus with 4 minutes and 37 seconds, and he goes down to 2 minutes and 39 seconds on this move. Magnus Carlsen is a player who has this great intuition and sense. When are the critical moments? When do you need to use your time? And be very, very careful. And he shows it once again. During my live commentary that I was doing on my Kick channel during the game, I thought that Magnus would actually play the move rook b1 fairly quickly, and after queen takes rook, bishop takes rook, rook takes knight, something like queen e2, white is still winning due to the terrible knight on h6, but it's not actually over immediately. But Magnus uses 2 moves, and he finds this great idea with c4. The reason is, if black were to say play queen c4, now there's rook to c1. Let's just say you go queen b5, rook c7. If you go here, it's spaghetti-o checkmate. And if you were to go king a6, now I have queen a2, queen a5, and I think there's bishop d3. There might even be a quicker mate, but after b5, trade and rook a7, and the king gets stuck on the edge of the board. So after c4, Alireza goes queen to a5 here, and now we get the move knight b4. If you were to go queen d7, another option, for example, now white can go queen b4, and after rook to b8 guarding the pawn, there's c5 here, threatening to break through. If you take, you're getting mated on all the diagonals and open files. And if you go b5 here, now white can go c6, sacking a pawn, takes, and queen to e7 check. If you go back, there's knight c7 check, you lose the queen. If you take the pawn, there's knight b4, which forks the king and the queen. The rook a1 might even be checkmate actually here. So white just has to rip open the protection around the black king to finish it off. So that's why Alireza goes queen a5 here. Now we get knight to b4, trying to go for the family fork with knight to c6. After knight to b4, we get the move rook to c8 being played, and now in this position, Magnus plays knight c6. Now, while the computer wants white to play c5 here, knight c6 is a very nice move from Magnus, because what he understands about the resulting endgame is after takes, white will have these 2 connected passed pawns to push up the c and the d file, and the bishop is still much better than the knight. So we get this endgame here. Knight f5 is played. Magnus goes d5. We get king takes a6, c5, of course. White trying to push the 2 connected pawns up the board. And to add insult to injury, the bishop on c6 also stops black from pushing his passed pawn, because it simply covers his a4 square. So the bishop covers the square, and it escorts the 2 pawns up the board. And at this point, the game is simply over. Alireza plays rook d8. We get rook to e6 being played. We have knight to d4. Bishop to a4 check played. Another move that showcases just how strong Magnus Carlsen's endgame understanding is, because at this point white is winning many different ways. d6 for example is one way, but rook e6 with bishop a4 is the best computer line. White sacks the rook on e6, because if black trades, now the bishop covers the checking square on d1, it covers a square on e8, and white just wants to go e7 e8. So not only does it cover the 2 critical squares, it also blockades the pawn from pushing, and white wins the game. Example, king b7, e7, attacking the rook moves, queen takes, king c7, bishop a4, and now it stops the pawn. You also can't go after the pawn, and white will just walk the king to the center of the board and win in short order. So after bishop to a4, Alireza goes king a7, we get rook to e7, now we have king to b8 being played, and now Magnus goes d6, Alireza plays rook c8, and we get this very nasty idea with rook e4, knight f5, and king to f2. Now Magnus Carlsen plays this very quiet move here because in this position black cannot capture either pawn. Black obviously cannot capture d6 because the pawn guards it, but if you were to capture the other pawn, the base of the chain, as in the game, now white goes rook to e8 check, king to b7, and after d7 white is pushing p, getting a second, or not getting a second queen, sorry, getting a queen on d8, and black will have to sack the rook for the queen. And after takes, Alireza Firouzja resigns this game, the first game of the best of two. Magnus Carlsen takes a 1-0 lead. Now in the second game, they would play a very chaotic Gucci piano, the Italian opening, with Alireza having the white pieces. Alireza would get some chance, but in the critical moments as it was getting messy, both players getting low on time, he would make a fatal blunder and lose that game, which means that Magnus Carlsen rebounds, loses in the best of 4 match, but comes back and plays like a god in the best of 2 match, and he wins the Chess Champions Tour Chessable Masters by winning the final match, beating Alireza Firouzja 2-0 in the final reset match. So Magnus Carlsen, dominating as usual, wins another online event. It feels like he wins nearly every single one of them, and this one to me is very, very impressive simply because of how poorly he played at the start and then the way he was able to rebound psychologically, find some incredible moves in this Trump-Howski game. These moves like bishop to a4, the c4 move, all the sacrifice with rook b6 and b5, just a perfect game for Magnus Carlsen, and he shows once again why he is the best player in the world. So on that note, if you guys have not already subscribed to my channel here on YouTube, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we will be back soon with some more great YouTube only content. See you guys. Bye.